Hello, my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. We've had a
Alberta is a
blockbuster
long, proud
press conference
history we're
today with
building
Mark
in
Carney
this.
and Premier David Eby about resource projects and infrastructure spending in the province of BC, presumably to presage the announcement expected later today about a pipeline from Alberta to BC, the route as undisclosed. So while on the one hand, it seemed to include all kinds of good news for BC, spending galore, billions and billions, I'd have to say there's a good deal of bad news in their announcement today. And the bad part had to do with the way in which they kept referring to the word ownership. Ownership of what and who owns what. Specifically, I'll point to this statement that stood out to me from David Eby. He said, and major projects move forward most successfully when First Nations are partners, supporters, and owners of those projects. Now, this is David Eby, who at a mining conference in Vancouver in January, which I recorded and put on social media, stated that he kind of jokingly said, I have no idea how mineral exploration works. He said those words. And I would say that's true. He doesn't know how it works because the way it works, um, I'll explain in a minute, but some of the big money announcements that were made today involved $500 million, for the Red Chris mine expansion. Now, and then there was also the North Coast transmission line, which is connected to resource extraction. $3.9 billion the feds are going to throw into the pot to build that transmission line. They're going to put a bunch of money into the Port of Vancouver and the Roberts Bank port facilities. They're going to cough up $3 billion for the Dees Tunnel. So this tunnel is finally going to get built. So they're going to throw some money into Prince Rupert and Stewart and these port. But here's the problem. The bad news is twofold. One, they've basically caved in to environmental activists on the tanker ban. So that kind of scrubs any hope for a Enbridge Northern Gateway project part two, which, let's face it, the shutting down of that project was driven by activists whose goal is to have zero oil infrastructure, zero fossil fuel infrastructure. So that's where they're coming from. So they've just kind of caved into that. So uh, that's not good news for the mining industry or any resource extractive industry, because it basically says, well, if environmental activists mobilize and oppose a project, they're going to be rewarded with a ban. So this is not good news. There should be no ban. You cannot just cave into that. So there's another thing that Carney said that I thought was rather strange. He talked about his grandfather working at the Anaconda mine in Britannia Beach. It's on Howe Sound on the way to Squamish. There's a museum there now you can check out. And he says, this time now in partnership, we are building in the right way. Well, what kind of nerve does Mark Carney have coming into British Columbia to dictate what the right way to do mining is? Well, What have the miners been doing for the last 30, 40 years in this province? What about Highland Valley? What about Red Chris? This has been in production for a long time. What about Mount Milligan? What about all the other mines that are currently in production? They've been doing it wrong? What does he know about what the right way is? Is the right way to gift First Nations with a big ownership stake in a mine? Well, clearly not, because the example is the New Prosperity mine, arguably one of the largest copper mines in the world, or one of the biggest in BC for sure, in Canada. Well, the EBA government last year basically gifted the Chilcotin First Nation with 21% interest in that mine and a veto over all production decisions. It now sits in the ground, likely never to be exploited. So is that the right way? How is that possibly the right way? So uh, normally, these projects have been developed under what are called socioeconomic benefit agreements. These agreements involve things like jobs, contracting, participation in uh, construction, the construction phase. So the spin-off benefits from a mine, it is the mining industry has been working on in collaboration with First Nations for decades, doing it right and making sure that First Nations people participate in the prosperity. Carney's coming in here and saying, like, oh no, you guys have got it all wrong. You don't know what you're doing. We're coming in here with our checkbook. Let's face it, it's taxpayer money. It's our own money. He's coming in here with our money and supposedly going to make it all right. So this $500 million for Red Chris, well, where's it going? So just to talk about Red Chris for a second, the NDP, EB has been gloating about the approval of the expansion of that mine. Well, here's a couple points to keep in mind. One, the expansion is underground. The biggest environmental hurdles for any mining project are relate to surface disturbance. For example, an open pit mine can create enormous amounts of surface disturbance. Well, the Red Chris expansion is underground. It's called a block cave. It's an amazing technology where uh, millions of tons of rock are drilled and blasted so that it slowly seeps down and drops down and crumbles into crushed ore at the bottom of the mine. And it is an extremely inexpensive and efficient way of mining. And it requires a lot of technology. So, so when EB says, and Carney, you're talking about ownership, Carney says, we will build inclusively in true partnership with First Nations, including those here along the Sailor Sea. Well, that's a bit of a hint on where the pipeline is going to be. That means Indigenous ownership to give communities a direct stake. Well, who has the stakes in the Red Chris mine? It is two companies. Newmont Corporation, an American company based in Denver, Colorado, owns 70% of Red Chris. 30% is owned by a Canadian company called Imperial Metals, which just so happens to be controlled by one of the oil billionaires from Alberta. So the fortunes that have been made in Alberta oil indirectly, well, actually directly, have enabled the Red Chris mine to exist in the first place. Imperial Metals put that into production and they owned 100%. Then they sold 70% to an Australian company called Newcrest. Then Newcrest was taken over by Newmont, and now Newmont, an American company. So this concept of ownership is very fuzzy, and perhaps uh, that's what I'll leave you with here, is that we need in this province to call out the media in particular need to be much more aggressive in investigating and sussing out and dismantling these buzzwords: partnership, ownership, collaboration. What exactly are they talking about? The ownership is known. I mean, and Carney, when he was talking about where his grandfather worked, he says, rather disparagingly, he says, it was foreign owned.
My grandfather worked in the 30s and 40s, early 50s in the Anaconda copper mine at Britannia Beach, which at its peak provided 1/5 of the world's copper supply. Created great prosperity. It was foreign owned.
Well, that's what's happening here in BC right now. Tech Corp, one of the greatest Canadian success stories of all time, now doing a merger with Anglo American. Who's going to control this company? So they own huge projects in BC, Galore Creek, um, the coal mining assets. A lot of coal comes from Tech Corp and now Anglo Tech. That coal goes to Delta Port at Roberts Bank. So what about the coal? Are we going to double? We're going to increase the capacity of coal generation and transport. So the ownership question. So I'll just leave you with this. If EB and Carney were doing such a bang up job, accelerating the resource economy of BC, why are so many mining companies suing the BC government? For example, there's a company now suing uh, the EB government over their de facto expropriation of a gold mine on Banks Island, which was the subject of the Gitsala case, which gave rise to the whole DRIPA instantiation in the first place. So, oh, well, doesn't matter. Well, we'll just they can lose their claims. And then that same lawsuit, which deprived this uh, American company of their ownership of this mine, they were told, hey, folks, come, why don't you take this out of receivership and help give us a helping hand here, and let's reclaim and this site and do all the right things to make this clean up this site and turn a bad thing into something good. Well, now they're completely out of luck. They don't even own the claims anymore. They were just choked right on out of their ownership. The jade mining industry, that's basically been killed off by the EB government. There's a lawsuit there. It's our national, our BC stone. There's litigation that is proceeding through the courts that is going to challenge DRIPA. And this is what it all gets back to. This is basically EB's DRIPA playbook. That's what we saw today. And Carney partnering up with him to back him up on that. In other words, First Nations have a veto. If and we're going to give them ownership. We're not going to tell you how they're going to get that ownership or who's going to have to give up the ownership or how much that ownership is going to cost, but they're going to own it. Well, is that really true? Are they owners of these projects? Well, the truth is they're not owners. The ownership of these mines are the people who own the mineral tenures. The mineral tenures give the owners of that tenure 100% right and title to the subsurface minerals. That's in law. Unfortunately, with the EB kind of tinkering and manipulation of the Mining Act, that's all kind of up in the air now because you can't even stake a mineral claim in BC anymore without tipping off First Nations as that you're going to do it. This has become an unfriendly jurisdiction for mining. But to be balanced, I think there has a major realization sunk in with the progressive governments in our country that no, you can't stop mining. That is bad for the country. You can't kill off the forestry sector for, to appease indigenous groups or environmental activists. And you can't keep oil in the ground. Now, one thing that EB let slip in this announcement today, this conference, is that he's not in favor of a pipeline, but they're not going to sue. He says, we will not sue over this pipeline. He said they learned an expensive lesson with obviously referring to John Horgan's suing the Alberta government and going to court and spending who knows how many tens of millions of dollars in court to try and block the twinning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So another big press conference scheduled for later today, where the public will learn where this new pipeline is going. It seems that's a fait accompli. It's just a question of where. So some good news in this announcement. Obviously, when there's billions of dollars and major infrastructure being built, and this is kind of the balanced part, the infrastructure required for resource development to occur, it's always been understood that the governments provide roads, electricity, other railroads, ports, that these keystone elements of infrastructure are provided and developed by taxpayers to enable the economy to prosper. The problem is, it's never, ever been, none of those things have ever been, quote unquote, owned by First Nations or in partnership with them. So these vague statements raise a big question mark over everything that was said today. It is something that could be clear, and it's not clear. It's vague. It's muddled. It's muddy. So why do we have to live like this with a muddled kind of hard to understand? And finally, I'll say this. There are negotiations occurring behind the scenes with no transparency with shareholders, with First Nations over resource projects. Taxpayers have no idea what's going on or who's getting what. So in my view, that's not helpful. That is not going to encourage investment. That's a impediment to investment, not knowing who owns things. That's kind of like rule step number one, who owns it? So that has been muddied and confused. So we'll look forward to what happens later today with the pipeline announcement. In the meantime, thanks for watching. My name's David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. If you enjoyed our journalism, please go to newwesttimes.com and subscribe to our newsletter. And if you feel so inclined, there's a button up in the corner that says support our work. If you would do so, we would greatly appreciate it. Until next time, thanks for watching.